Believed to have been written between 1596 and 1599, The Merchant of Venice, though classified as a comedy in the first folio, is perhaps most remembered for its dramatic scenes. Some modern audiences object to the play because they mistakenly believe it to be anti-Semitic. While many of the characters are indeed anti-Semitic, expressing anti-Semitic sentiments, the play itself is not anti-Semitic. If I believed it were, I would not assign it as a play to be read and discussed for this class. Shakespeare likely drew from several sources in writing The Merchant of Venice. The Jew, by Stephen Gosson; Il Perserone, or The Dunce, an Italian collection of prose tales by Ser Giovanni Fiorentino; and The Jew of Malta by Christopher Marlowe. Shylock the Jew is, as the title page of the first quarto puts it, a figure of extreme cruelty. His cruelty, however, was not in his Jewishness, but in his money-lending. Antonio is the merchant of Venice in The Merchant of Venice, and the protagonist of the play. Shylock is a moneylender and the antagonist of the play. To really appreciate the significance of Shylock being a moneylender or a usurer, we need to know something about the religious and judicial context concerning moneylending or usury in Shakespeare's time. In the Old Testament, Exodus and Leviticus prohibit lending to the poor on interest. But Deuteronomy forbids charging interest or usury of one's brother, regardless of his economic status, but permits it with a stranger. Quote, "Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victual, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury." Jews felt this allowed usury with anyone other than a Jew. Christians saw this as disallowing usury with any fellow citizen. However, by Henry VIII, the old laws against usury were abolished, and a rate of 10% was indirectly legalized by fixing of severe penalties for any rate higher. But the practice, regardless of the percentage, was still socially condemned. In 1552, by Edward VI, the Act of Henry VIII was annulled, and severe penalties were enacted against any usury whatsoever. In 1570, before Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, Elizabeth annulled the Act of Edward VI and reenacted the Act of Henry VIII. But, quote, "Forasmuch as all usury, being forbidden by the law of God, is sin and detestable, Elizabeth's law ordained that even interest at 10% or lower was forfeitable." In other words, collecting interest was legal, but not enforceable by law. The typical usurer, however, found devious ways of enacting his 10% and more. Think of them as loan sharks. His victims were usually the very needy and young gentlemen not yet possessed of their inheritance. The Elizabethans must have been hostile to Shylock as soon as they recognized him as a usurer. And yet, Shylock is doubly guilty. A moneylender and a Jew, two of the deepest social abominations of the age. Shakespeare's society was much more homogeneous than ours. Persons of color were essentially unknown, except for an occasional stranger brought to England as an exhibit. Jews had been officially expelled from England in the time of Edward I, back in 1290. Although a few still lived unobtrusively in London, attending Anglican services as required by law. Still, they were not officially readmitted until 1655, under Cromwell, years after Shakespeare's death. Thus, Shakespeare's Shylock was most likely drawn from stereotypes, rather than from living persons. On the Elizabethan stage, Shylock most likely wore the stereotypical red hair and beard and a hooked nose, like Elizabethans believed Judas Iscariot was supposed to have had. Shakespeare and his contemporaries found Jews, along with Ethiopians, Turks, witches, and hunchbacks, useful tools. These feared and despised figures provided a quick and easy orientation, clear boundaries within a staged comedy. The Jew was the measuring device. Even after the revolution under Cromwell in 1689, a bill specifically to tax the Jews was introduced into Parliament, and from the pulpit they continued to be condemned. Robert South, the best-known preacher in England a century after Shakespeare's death, declared in a long and virulent passage that it was the bitterest humiliation of Christ's life on earth that he should be born of the race of the Jews. Quote, the most sordid and degenerate upon the earth. South continued, quote, and to this very day, how much they are disgusted in all those kingdoms and dominions where they are dispersed. They are like the dung upon the face of the earth, and that not so much for their being scattered as for being so offensive. End quote. Shakespeare's Christian characters seem to share Robert South's views. In fact, several racist elements exist in the play. For example, Portia's racist comments about all her foreign suitors are disturbing. Moreover, the ill treatment of Shylock by Antonio, Gratiano, and the others is shocking and appalling to a modern audience. Their remarks and treatment of Shylock are particularly offensive to modern readers who still feel the sting of the Holocaust of World War II, centuries after Shakespeare wrote this play. However, Shakespeare at once gives voice to the prejudices of these characters and reveals it for what it truly is. This becomes unquestionably evident in the casket-choosing plot at Belmont, when Portia's suitors must guess at what is inside a casket by viewing what is on the outside. The casket love test does more than test the moral competence of her prospective husbands. It underscores the disparity between the visible and veiled nature of people, between that which we see, such as race and religion, on the outside, and that which we don't see, everyone's intrinsic human value and worth on the inside. Furthermore, Shakespeare provides other Jews within this play with whom we are clearly meant to sympathize. Tubal is a good Jew who appears disapproving of Shylock's thirst for revenge and who loans money to Shylock without interest. Throughout the play, Tubal remains a Jew of high moral standing, and no Christian ever says anything derogatory to him or about him. And Jessica, Shylock's daughter, is not only accepted by the Christians, but marries one of them. While it is true that she converts to Christianity, she clearly does so not as a rejection of her faith or heritage, but as a rejection of her father. Jessica flees from an overbearing, hateful father, and her only means of severing that filial association is to sever a religious one. Lastly, Shakespeare gives Shylock powerful lines that remind his audience of the shared humanity beneath the visible differences of race and religion. He has Shylock criticize harshly and unanswerably the moral integrity of Christians, who appear one way but behave another.
It will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000. Laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies, and what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands? Organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we shall resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, What should his sufferance be? By Christian example. Why? Revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard. But I will better the instruction.
Through Shylock's words, we find a harsh criticism of the prejudice and hypocrisy of Christians in Shakespeare's England. Certainly Shakespeare, who was raised a Catholic, understood the physical threat of belonging to a religious minority. He knew what it meant to be ostracized and distrusted because of one's beliefs. Shakespeare's mother's family was under close investigation, some of whom were tortured and killed for their Catholic faith. He may not have known any Jews, but Shakespeare would certainly have known religious persecution. Shakespeare would also certainly be familiar with usurers, beginning with his own father, who had twice been accused of violating the law by charging interest. Shakespeare himself seems to have been involved in at least one transaction involving interest, either on his own or as a middleman. Christian usurers such as Shakespeare and his father occupied a position roughly comparable to one held by Jews. Officially, they were despised, harassed, condemned from the pulpit and from the stage. As both a usurer and a religious outsider, Shakespeare seems to empathize with Shylock even while his Christian characters are berating him. Nonetheless, as John Brown notes, we cannot doubt that Shylock must be condemned. However lively Shylock's dialogue may be, however plausibly and passionately he presents his case, however cruelly the lovers treat him, he must still be defeated, because he is an enemy to love's wealth and its free, joyful, and continual giving. In Shakespeare's play, Shylock is the villain, not so much because he is a Jew, but because he is the traditional killjoy of romantic comedy, deaf to music, the enemy of pleasure. He stands in the way of young love, the conventional, tyrannical, possessive father who must be defeated by budding youth. Shylock, as powerful and convincing as many of his lines are, and as tragic and inhumane we find his treatment, was definitely presented on stage as the villain in this love comedy. Why? Well, for starters, all the characters, excepting Tubal, who come in contact with Shylock have nothing but evil to say of his character. Even his own daughter thinks ill of him. 2. Sympathy at the theater was traditionally for the amorous son or the eloping daughter against the hard-hearted, stingy father. Jessica and Shylock fit neatly into these opposing roles. Cheating the old man provided sport and pleasure in the theater. 3. Shylock laments over his daughter and his ducats simultaneously. He even wishes his daughter were dead if he could get his jewels back. Thus, Shylock's love of his daughter is degraded below that of his love for money. As a money lover, Shylock is clearly the villain. Finally, whenever Shylock gains our sympathies, he loses them almost immediately afterward in his hatred, thirst for revenge, or greed. Every time he speaks moving lines that draw our attention to the hypocrisy and prejudice of the Christians, he then concludes with hate and ire and greed of his own. A comic playwright thrives on laughter, and a Jew was an easy target in Renaissance theater. But it is almost as if Shakespeare were repelled as well as fascinated by the mockery, as if he understood how to play the ancient game of using outcasts as villains, but simultaneously felt queasy about the rules. No one comes off as the moral hero in this play. Everyone is a villain to one degree or another, making this a complex, dark comedy, an exposé on hypocrisy and prejudice, which are tragically found among all of us, regardless of our religious and racial differences.